What would a world be without the Elric Brothers? Would it be able to survive? The possibilities are endless. So let's dive right into one of these possibilities. I'm Crown Fiend, and let's begin this story now. We begin the story with Von Hohenheim talking to the love of his life, Trisha Elric, who happens to be pregnant with a child. Hohenheim tells her, "I've been thinking, maybe it would be nice to have a son like me."
Well, that would be certainly nice. Wouldn't it require doing the same thing that made you how you are, though?
Trisha asks. Hohenheim then lowers his head, saying, "I know that, and I could never allow myself to do that, or I would truly become a monster, my love." Trisha would comfort her husband, saying, "We have a child on the way. Let's just wait. I'm sure they'll be just like you anyway." The couple would go on living a normal life for a few more months until a disease would sweep over the land and Trisha would fall ill much sooner than in canon. Hohenheim would be terrified. He could lose his wife and unborn child at the same time. Trisha, seeing this, would say that she'll be fine to encourage Hohenheim. Hohenheim would go out drinking with Pinocchio that night, breaking down in tears, telling her his concerns. Pinocchio shares his worries. As a mother herself and soon-to-be grandmother, she can sympathize with her old friend. Weeks pass as the month crawls to an end. Trisha ends up passing away in Hohenheim's arms, with his tears running down his face. As Trisha says, "I'm sorry I couldn't last a little longer. I just wish the baby could have survived." "What would you have named our child, Trisha?" Hohenheim would ask.
"Edward. I always loved that name,"
Trisha said weakly as she died in Hohenheim's arms. Overcome with grief and emotion, Hohenheim cradles his wife's body until Pinocchio comes over later that day to see the state of Hohenheim. "It's time to lay her to rest, my old friend," Pinocchio would say, to no response. "Please, Hohenheim, we need to give her a proper funeral and lay her body and spirit to rest," Pinocchio would continue to say, pleading with Hohenheim. "Them to rest. We need to lay them to rest, Pinocchio," Hohenheim would say coldly, with an empty look in his eyes. The next few days would pass as Trisha's funeral is held. Hohenheim tells Pinocchio that he's going to be leaving, but that he will return in 10 years. Pinocchio asks why he's leaving, only for Hohenheim to stare at an image of Trisha and struggle to stay composed. Pinocchio gives Hohenheim the picture and tells him to keep it. As Hohenheim leaves in the morning after, "I know this may be seen as rather pretentious, but my son will survive, and I'll give my life to do it," Hohenheim says to himself. His resolve was strengthened the more he thought about it. Hohenheim thought endlessly about how Edward would look, even the last name that he should have. Trisha's and his conversations kept flooding his mind until Hohenheim finally had the image in his mind. All that was left was to give life to his thoughts. Hohenheim went out into the middle of nowhere, and once night fell, he gathered everything he needed for a human body and transmuted it, along with giving up 99% of his own Philosopher's Stone to go towards Edward's creation. After what felt like days, Hohenheim had created Edward Elric, his very own son. Hohenheim hugged his son, weeping endlessly out of pure joy. Edward, not knowing what was happening, simply hugged back. Edward had the appearance of how he did in canon when he looked about 15 years old. Of course, he wouldn't have the metal arm since he never committed human transmutation, but you guys get the gist of what I'm trying to say. "I'll finally have you, my very own son, If only Trisha could have met you, Hohenheim would say. The next decade would be spent with Edward and Hohenheim bonding, as Hohenheim would teach Edward everything he could, as Edward would grasp things very easily. Hohenheim would be aging slowly but noticeably every year until now he was bedridden. Edward, my son, I'm not long for this world anymore. Soon I'll be with your mother, Hohenheim would say peacefully. Ed, I want you to go to a small town called Resembool to look for a family by the name of Rockbell. They're friends of ours. An old woman named Pinocchio was a drinking buddy of mine, Hohenheim said weakly. That's enough, Father. You need to rest, and you'll feel better. I promise you will, Dad, Ed would say with tears running down his face. Listen to the final words of your father, Edward, while I still have the strength to speak them. These past 10 years with you have been more than I could have ever hoped for. When your mother died, I was plunged into despair so great that I almost considered doing the impossible. Promise me that you'll move on with your life and that you'll never attempt human transmutation. It's the only truly unforgivable sin in life, Edward. No matter how painful life is, you must never do it. Promise me, Edward. Promise me you'll never attempt it, Hohenheim said firmly. I promise, Father, Ed replied, crying on his knees, breaking down in tears. Edward, you have a strong body. Don't let this be the end of you. Get up and walk on your own 2 feet, even when it hurts like hell. You may very well end up walking through hell, but you must keep going, even when the world feels like it's crushing you beneath its surface. Just keep your head up high and use your power to help others, my son, Hohenheim would say, as he would take one last look at Edward before passing away, as his philosopher's stone was burnt up. Edward cried out in pain and sorrow, losing his only remaining family member. After a few days, Ed arranged for Hohenheim's body to be sent back to Resembool with him. Ed would ride the train, remembering all the times with his father, and looking at the picture of his mother who he never got to meet. Eventually, Ed would arrive in Resembool, finding his way to the Rockbell family home. Knocking on the door to see a little girl with blonde hair open it, expecting her parents. However, all she saw was Edward. As tears started to form in her eyes as a voice called out, "Winry, who's at the door?" the voice asked, as a small old lady would come to see Edward, as she introduced herself as Pinocchio Rockbell. Pinocchio would invite Ed inside. As he introduced himself, Pinocchio would be shocked, asking, "What happened to Hohenheim?" Ed would say that his father had died a few days ago, while fighting back tears as he pulled out a photo of Trisha to give to Pinocchio. Looking at the picture, Pinocchio began to cry as she knew her friend had done something so incredibly stupid. Ed would be shown to his family's house, where he found his father's study completely undisturbed. Ed would spend all his time before the funeral studying everything and coming to understand a bit of what his father knew. Understanding this, Ed would practice his alchemy more and more. Once the funeral happens, Ed would begin to open up to Winry and Pinocchio. Through the conversation, he would learn about the state alchemists, along with them being called the dogs of the military. Edward would enjoy spending time with them. However, he felt like this isn't what he should be doing. Ed would think about this before getting aggravated and seek out Pinocchio. "Granny, I feel like just living here in this little town, this peaceful life, it isn't what I should be doing," Ed would say. "Ed, your father wanted you to come here for a reason. If living a peaceful life feels wrong to you, then look through everything he left you. Maybe there you'll find your answer, Pinocchio would say with a smile. That's exactly what Ed does. He begins to read through everything that Hohenheim left to him in his study. Page after page, book after book, Ed reads and comprehends all of it. However, once Ed gets to the book about human transmutation, he freezes. Father, I miss you so much. Every day. This book says it's possible to revive you, but I promised that I wouldn't do it. I don't know what to do. It's so hard by myself. I barely got to really know you, and you left me all alone. Please come back, Father, Ed would say through tears. Pinocchio, who was behind the door, overheard everything, and tears filled her eyes. Ed, it's time for dinner, Pinocchio would say, acting like she didn't hear anything. I'll be over there in a minute, Granny, Ed would say, pretending he wasn't crying. It would have been a year now since Ed came to Resemble. During that year, he bonded with Pinocchio and Winry, who he now saw as his granny and little sister. Ed would always come over to eat and help with the dishes and chores, as well as play with Winry. In this timeline, Ed is way more mature than in canon, but also still has a bit of a temper. After dinner, Ed would help clean up before going back home to sleep. However, this night, Ed would have a dream about a man called Slave 23, talking to what he called the dwarf in the flask, Homunculus. Then hearing the dwarf in the flask call Slave 23 von Hohenheim, that startled Ed awake as he woke up and covered in sweat, knowing that to be his father. It's almost as if he was seeing his father's memories. Ed would then calm down and attempt to go back to sleep, hoping to see more. That night, Ed was shown every single memory that Hohenheim had. Ed knew what needed to be done. With a heavy heart, he began to pack his bags in hopes of finding an alchemy teacher. He was planning on telling Granny and Winry, but didn't know the right words, so Ed would go for a walk to think about how to tell them. While on his walk, he heard a commotion, so he went to see what it was. When he arrived, he saw a woman on the ground puking blood. Ed went over to her side, asking if she was all right. Once Ed put his hand on her, he knew something was wrong. "What happened to your insides?" Ed asked. "How do you know about that, kid?" The woman would ask, shocked. "Izumi, are you okay?" A huge muscular man would say, running over. "Izumi, is that your name?" Ed would ask. Izumi would nod, and Ed knew he had to do something. As he tried to use alchemy to help her, using the power from his Philosopher's Stone, Ed was able to restore Izumi's insides to how they were before. Izumi would be surprised that such a feat was possible, especially in such a small town. "Kid, just who are you?" And that's where I'm going to be leaving this one off. I hope you guys have enjoyed this first ever Full Metal Alchemist What If. And yes, I will be going down Brotherhood's anime adaptation, but adding in some of the events from the manga that the anime skipped, like the train ride to Central along with the State Alchemist certification test. So, those issues will be covered in the second part. As always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.